Greetings, my name is Xavier Cortada, and I am pleased to be with you here today at the extended scientific sessions of the International Scientific Conferences in Social Sciences. And I'm going to be talking to you about my practice, specifically how I use the elasticity of art to work across disciplines in engaging others to problem solve. And today on our planet, as a pandemic continues to threaten the lives and livelihoods of so many across the world. And as racial and social justice demands to be addressed, and as we are amid a climate emergency that will impact not just humans on the planet, but all the animals that we co-evolved with for decades to come, for centuries to come, and with the sixth mass extinction for millions of years to come. It is essential that we use that universal language of art, the very language that our species used as it traversed the African continent from the moment it evolved 200,000 years ago, and then just 60,000 years ago as it left that continent and moved into the rest of our planet, following nature, stopping where there was drought, thriving where there was rain and environment and growth, where there was places for hunting and gathering, but all along the way using this universal language to communicate complex ideas that made their brains even more attuned to growing the species from a mid-level species on the food web to an apex predator that has completely transformed every other species and ecosystem. In fact, ended wilderness as it was on this planet. At that moment, at this crucial moment, we must go back to the very thing that created us as a species, the very thing that we are imbued with as humans, the very thing that we own as humans, that all of us have, that creative spirit, that creativity within us to advance our species and be smart enough to understand that unless we do that with all the other species that we co-evolved with, we do so at our peril. At this moment, at this precipice of catastrophe, at a time when everything is on the table, it is important to use the power of art to help us visualize a different world, to help us imagine beyond ourselves, and to be able to use that transformative power of art to communicate complex ideas with one another to move our society into a future. So I use socially engaged art to do just that. And in many ways, I do so by trying to make the invisible visible. Another way of saying that is by trying to reframe what it is that we do and see in our world so that we can behave and act towards that new imagined place that we can create and develop. And we as a species have the capacity to do that. We create magical things. Magical things like this, the largest machine ever built by humans, a Large Hadron Collider that straddles Switzerland and France, a place where 4,000 scientists, as part of one of their experiments, created this machine, this instrument that allows scientists to discover the Higgs boson, an essential discovery to prove the standard model of physics, done so across 178 universities, 40 countries, 4,000 scientists and engineers that came together to build something that is clearly invisible to the naked eye, but was worth celebrating as a huge discovery that helped move humanity forward. I went there not to depict the invisible, but to celebrate the passion that these committed scientists and thinkers had in their discovery, in their lifelong pursuit to advance our species. And these very banners hang at the very location where this protons collided into one another to create this boson, this subatomic particle, as a way of celebrating, a site-specific celebration to honor the scientists and the science. And I do that because in a world like the one we live in, where across nations we see polarized governments, polarized citizens who believe in ideology and not on facts, who don't understand that our world vision can and needs to be defined by science, that in many ways, physics, the laws of physics, are the ones that help us understand who we are and how our universe is governed. That chemistry allows us to understand how all of that is put together, in biology, how it works. That if we have this enthusiasm and love for science, and so doing pique the curiosity of individuals to learn more about it, to be science literate, and to understand the role and value that science plays in their lives, then we are able to create a cadre of engaged citizens, of future scientists, of future policymakers, thinkers, parents, bankers, artists, who all share the same worldview and the same procedures to assess whether something is true or isn't true, or how we find out more, and different ways of thinking and discovering. That is important, not just to create a better human being, but also to create a better world, a better way of governance, a better way of dealing with problems. So I, as an artist, use socially engaged art, working with physicists, working with scientists to create, to visualize, to help us understand things in a different light. I did the same thing at the South Pole in 2007 as part of the National Science Foundation. I was invited to be part of this fellowship, and while there, I used the moving sheet at the South Pole, a sheet that moves 10 meters a year down the 60 meridian towards Argentina, and marked it with the flags that would have stood at the South Pole had that ice sheet not moved. In so doing, I captured 50 years of human habitation at that pole when I landed there and installed these flags on January the 4th of 2007. On each flag, I put the coordinates in the world above about important discoveries that happened in each of those years. Again, what scientists and thinkers and scholars had been doing in the world above, while that flag, that piece of ice, marked 90 degrees south. In essence, I was trying to show, using Roji Biv, the colors of human vision, what humanity's impact was on the planet. But importantly, there was a lot of real estate beyond those flags and before those flags. In other words, human history isn't the only history on this planet. There's a natural history, and there is a time beyond 50 years, no matter how great the events of those 50 years were. And we needed to celebrate the scientists who were there, advancing science and learning about glaciology, learning about the science of our planet, while all these other events were happening in the world above. While all that is true and real and valuable, there is also geological time. I planted a mangrove replica, piece of mangrove propagule that was put into a mold and then created into ice using water, melted at the South Pole. That piece, using that same trajectory of a moving glacier, will take 150,000 years to arrive at the edge of that continent and theoretically set its roots on the water as a mangrove plant. That's clearly about the same amount of time that it took our species to evolve and to get to where we are today. That there are moments that are beyond the way we can imagine things. And by creating art that, again, allow us to insert ourselves into the piece and understand our place in our world, how important we are, but more importantly, how bigger than us life, this planet, ecosystems, that indeed we are interconnected to one another, and that if we understood that everything that has lived, lives, or will ever live is made with the same molecules that we are, the same nucleotides that we are made up of, then we understand our role in this planet across space and time. And in so doing, understand our role as custodians, and in so doing can help advance life on this planet by understanding how interconnected we are to all species, all people, and everything that happens in this planet today. Again, as an artist, I look at art as a way of helping us see, helping us understand these things. And I do so particularly because, as we know, there are 415 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. That has caused extreme heat on our planet, and that heat is causing all sorts of disturbances, from rising seas to drought to hurricanes that are wetter, that are stronger, and that are slower, so they stay and wreck and wreck and wreck the place where they make landfall. We know that this happens because we are fueling these hurricanes with warmer seas, and we are making those seas warmer by polluting, by literally putting carbon into the atmosphere. That atmosphere warms our planet, melts our glaciers, melts our sea ice, and causes all sorts of feedback mechanisms that continue to bring destruction to our planet, to our civilization, to our world of life. And it's important that we understand the word our, as in we are interconnected. At the South Pole in 2007, and then again at the North Pole in 2008, I created these installations, longitudinal installations, where I tried to create a sense of empathy and connectedness by bringing 24 quotes from 24 people around the globe who back in 2006 were lamenting and commenting on how global climate change was impacting their coral reefs, their glaciers, their permafrost, their snow seasons, their droughts, their food scarcity. And I wanted to bring those to this global roundtable. So I, as their proxy, stood in their shoes and spoke their words. And I did so inches apart from one another, because of course the longitudes are very far away in the world above, but as we approach the poles, they converge to zero. And I wanted to do this at two places where climate change is most heartily felt, and where it has the most impact on transforming life as we know it on the rest of the planet, by releasing water, raising seas, and bringing havoc to every place where land touches water. I also create processes that involve other participants, other hosts. In this case, during the climate talks, I invited the bishop of the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of South Florida, the most vulnerable diocese vis-a-vis sea level rise in the continental United States. And he celebrated Mass at my art exhibit using water from the melted ice that I brought from the South Pole, and then created vials to be shared with every single one of the parishes in his diocese on that Sunday of the parish talks, as a way of, again, using art, working with different groups, in this case, the faith community, to be able to have, in this case, parishioners understand their role and their connection to their faith and protecting the planet and one another. I also use processes like these at places that are completely surprising. At my solo exhibition, I literally had ice melt, huge chunks of ice melt on the floor and create havoc, because global climate change is creating havoc, and it is not predictable, and it comes and it doesn't care what your party is, it doesn't care whether you believe that humans cause climate change or not. It is going to come, it is going to disrupt, it is going to destroy economies, lives, ecosystems. So I did that as a performance piece in my art exhibit, but I also did it through programming at that exhibit beyond its opening night. In this case, I worked with school children who were supposed to inherit homes from their parents who worked all their lives to build equity in that home and be able to transfer to that child. I asked them to bring the property values, their papers, their deeds, claiming how much their property was worth. As we know, as property values sink, the amount that's owed on that home makes that value or that property go underwater, is determined real estate. Well, I had them make little paper boats out of their property bills and created a flotilla that would show that not only would the value of their property sink below what was owed to the bank, where the property of the value would be completely worthless with rising seas, but not just economically, but physically, because eventually it wouldn't just be the psychology of rising seas, it would be waves lapping at their doorsteps. So again, as an artist, I try to help you visualize what is to come in the future by creating these processes today. For those that can't wait for the future, I remind them of heat. I remind them how climate change isn't just melting glaciers, it is causing heat strokes at 3 p.m. this afternoon in your hometown. So working with the Red Cross and the Union of Concerned Scientists, I had elderly fry eggs on a solar panel as a way of visualizing that we are living in the hottest decade of recorded history, because we now have 415 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, making it hotter than it has been in recorded human history and putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than there have been at least in the last 800,000 years since we've been able to record and capture the pollutants in the atmosphere. I also create other concepts where I literally have people incorporate my art into their bodies. In this case, on my return from the North Pole, I had a dinner party where I literally had people eat the North Pole. And my goal was to have them understand that if they had this North Pole communion, then the North Pole would be part of their bodies and they would not want to kill or mutate or harm their own bodies, the North Pole molecules. So they should act as stewards and keep the North Pole from melting so that it could sustain the ecosystems around the Arctic Circle. Again, these are performative works. These are socially engaged works that help us see differently. I wanted to make water a protagonist. So at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, I literally had the water paint on the paper. I went to the different weirs of this forest where acid rain was discovered 60 years ago and literally had the water paint the art pieces. I've also worked in more traditional ways of visualizing, in this case, working with scientists at the experimental forest where I serve on the committee of scientists, where I have been an artist in residence since 2012, to create a water visualization platform where you can in real time understand how all of the water is moving in a watershed through the water cycle. And when there is an extreme event like one that happened a few days ago, you can literally go and visualize everything that happened within that water cycle. Again, a way of seeing things and seeing patterns and visualizing them in ways that heretofore weren't able to be seen. This is the McMurdo Dry Valleys in Antarctica. I'm part of this collaboration as well, the McMurdo Dry Valleys Long-Term Ecological Research Group. And the sediment that you find here at the edge of these frozen lakes was sediment that I used back in 2007 to create my Antarctic ice paintings. Not just the sediment, but ice the scientists gave me that I created in my studio, a laboratory turned studio in Antarctica, using the very elements, the ice and processes, the melting, that caused this piece are the same ones that are going to melt and drown my city of Miami. In fact, the ice paintings that I created in Antarctica in 2007 are the precursor of the horrors to come to my shoreline in the years to come. And I was so outraged about this that I actually shared these art pieces with Governor Schwarzenegger, then the governor of California, and Governor Christ, there and the governor of my state, at a summit to address the issue of clean energy and global climate change. In the recent years, I've discovered that I wanted to integrate more people, not just use them in exhibits for advocacy, but I wanted neighbors to learn from neighbors. Again, a truly socially engaged practice. So I used the backdrop of these markers that I created to mark the elevation of people's properties. And in the backdrop, I replicated my ice paintings. In the foreground, I painted a number, the elevation in feet, but how many feet above sea level your property was. And I created a squiggly white line, squiggly line across to measure the idea of rising seas. And the more pollutants we put in the atmosphere, the more we lose our ability to ask our policymakers to put regulations and create systemic change, stop subsidizing the fuel industry, start investing in clean energy, start creating regulations across the board so that individuals de facto become environmentalists because that's the only product they can buy. That's the only service they can receive because it is regulated that way. Unless we did that, we would have these rising seas. And when that wave reached your number, your elevation is when your house would be underwater. I called this group the Underwater Homeowners Association, and I did so because I wanted us to be able to, again, see the future or see into the future in ways that we as a society avoid doing, because it's so much easier to kick the can down the road, or it's so much easier to put your head in the sand and be in denial about what's in front of your very eyes. So as an artist, it was my responsibility to map the topography, but not just having me doing it, not having me place numbers, but engaging individuals so that they themselves knew what their elevation was and they proactively put a sign in their front yards and they proactively ask their neighbors to do the same. And in that process, create a dialogue, a conversation with one another so that they could begin to effectuate change. They could begin to be the advocates to tell their elected officials that they cared more about the future property value of their home than they cared about the kind of tax break that they would get in 2 years or 4 years, which are the political cycles of elections that politicians are responsive to. They wanted politicians to think and plan not in 2 and 4 year terms, but in longer terms so that the community as a whole could be protected through time. Again, using art to visualize, to understand where the water is going across the topography of a community that's ground zero for sea level rise was a socially engaged art practice to make the invisible visible and to make sea level rise a problem impossible to ignore. There's a CNN video that captures how we did this. Let me play that for you for a couple of minutes.
Short drive from Delano downtown to bargaining, depression, and acceptance in Pinecrest.
I live in Pinecrest. I'm at 11.
I'm 8.54 feet.
I need to steal kids on the time.
Where neighbors have formed America's first underwater homeowners association.
I'm at 7 feet. More than I thought, to be honest. My name's Judy, and I'm here for hope and for inspiration.
There was some really negative response where people recoiled and say, why are you doing this? You're going to hurt us and hurt our property values, which I found to be part of the cancer I'm trying to cure. It is the brainchild of artist and activist Xavier Cortada.
What's happening in our community?
Before water covers the street in the next century, there will be an aquifer below it that will not give you the fresh water that you drink in these homes. And before that happens, there's going to be a flood insurance rise. As that happens, there's going to be property value devaluation because all of a sudden the psychology of a house being an investment is going to be starting to turn on its head.
Now, my home is in danger, a whole bunch of homes next to me.
The fear is palpable here in Miami. So what I want to do is give people a mechanism for coping and dealing with that fear and preparing for the inevitable.
So this was an art piece that, again, aimed at working with, it's an art piece that aimed at working with community to have the neighbors be the change agents in their society, in their community.
Sure.
And the reason that is so important is because this is what my beloved city, the only place that I've ever called home. I moved here. My parents, 2 Cuban refugees, moved me here from Albany, New York in 1967, and I have never left. And unfortunately, those dark blue spaces along the left side of this map are people's homes. There are literally hundreds of thousands of my neighbors who will suffer. The problem is they don't know they're vulnerable. They think that the vulnerable parts are the coasts, the Atlantic Ocean. That's Miami's first coastline. But there's a second coastline. It's the Everglades. All that area in green is the Florida Everglades. It was called the River of Grass. In time, the Florida Everglades, just like Miami Beach, will be consumed by rising seas. And the waters will encroach and submerge neighborhoods that, unlike some of the coastal communities that have wealth and a tax base, high density, and a reason to be saved, at least for the short term, with pumps and elevated roads, there is no tax base and really no political will to take care of the western part of the county. But again, if neighbors understand that dilemma, if they put markers in the fronts of their homes, if they have community meetings where they work with one another and they can learn together and work together, they can begin to understand that. So what I did is, in my community, my studio is based at Pinecrest Gardens in this map. So I worked with my village to create an art piece where we would map the topography of the city. And one would assume that the closer you are to the water, the eastern part of my community, the more vulnerable you are, and the farther west you go, the safer you are because there's higher ground. But that's not our topography. It's all relatively low. There's nothing higher than about 20 feet in this area above sea level. But there is a ridge that cuts across the community. People aren't aware of that because it's a very subtle ridge, and it's all been developed with asphalts and homes and fill. But as you go from east to west, what you see is that the land rises and then it diminishes, it goes back down. And no one understood that. So I created a process where our participants went on an app, they typed in their address, typing in their address, they found out what their elevation is, and they were able to put that in front of their homes. We also painted it on the streets. So as people were driving by the streets, again, our participants were engaged in the process to communicate this new idea, to visualize it. So you would literally drive and you would see a number 7. So you would know that that particular part of the community was at 7 feet. Or at 6 feet at different elevations. And again, we did the same thing by placing it in people's homes. That created an opportunity for us to bring these individuals together into a homeowners association where they would come in and talk and explain all of the issues that they were addressing or tackling with, and began to plan and think about the future. When a hurricane is coming to Miami, We know it's 3 or 4 days away, and we all do our part. We put our shutters on the windows, we get our supplies, we make sure that there's no flying objects in our backyard, we get water, we bring the elderly to shelter, right? We prepare for the danger to come. But for something that seems far away, for something that is invisible, but that unlike a hurricane will not end after the eye passes over us. Sea level rise will not recede. And the federal government, unlike a hurricane that can come in along with your insurance companies and make you whole, sea level rise will hit every community across our nation and continent and planet at the same time. So definitely the United States government won't be able to make every home in every city that gets flooded protected. So neighbors have a sense of urgency to work with one another now. And through my art, I try to create these processes for them to better understand the reality that we're living in now. Learning together and working together, we can achieve great things. Importantly, I believe that this form of slow activism is the only true way of addressing the issue in an ever polarized and imperfect world. We then create new processes. During these past presidential elections, we made our underwater HOA signs into vote signs. We wanted people to vote on climate, vote for the president, vote for the elected officials who would have a climate agenda. So again, homeowners coming together, understanding, becoming curious, becoming experts, becoming stewards, becoming engaged citizens who can begin to effectuate real positive change, one individual at a time. And that is the essence of that practice. I'd be remiss in ending this presentation without acknowledging clearly, as I had mentioned at the beginning, art pieces that I've created to address our pandemic. We are in the middle of a pandemic that was completely mishandled by the United States, by the President of the United States. A pandemic that had me lose 2,500 of my fellow Americans today alone. A pandemic that has killed thousands of my neighbors here in Miami. And I wanted to document this moment, inspired by the work I did in South Africa during the World AIDS Conference in 2000, when I stared at the seas, at the ocean, at the coastline in Durban, at the waves that continued coming to shore, and imagined all the dead Africans because of HIV and AIDS. Africans who did not have the medicine, who did not have the healthcare system, who did not have the prevention services available because of all the stigma and drama created around a virus, a disease. I wanted to capture those deaths in that moment so that we as society would mark that in a day where there would be no AIDS on our planet. Clearly that day has not come. Instead, we have another pandemic in front of us. And again, a pandemic we were not prepared for, and a pandemic that we did not steer and deal with properly. I was wanting to have my fellow citizens understand that, so I created a series of drawings on a daily basis where I literally marked all of the individuals who had passed, who had died in my community during that pandemic. That piece was called the Miami Pronouncement. And it's online in an exhibit at my university. Of course, it's the only way to access an exhibit these days, online. At the bottom of your screen, you have the URL to that exhibit at the University of Miami. It's called Pandemic, the Miami Corona Project. In it, you'll be able to see the video, the very painful video of me sitting and drawing the dead people of Miami throughout this pandemic until the day that Biden was pronounced president-elect. Similarly, during the pandemic, I had conversations with art curators, with scientists, with teachers, with elected officials and people running for office, so that I could get their perspective on the lessons learned about this pandemic and what we needed to do to move forward with it. That too is part of the exhibition. I also created a series of updates where I would update on a daily basis with my neighbors what was the numbers of dead at the national level and at the local level. And all of this was to create a platform where my neighbors could come together and share their stories about how the pandemic had affected them, because very clearly we realized that there were two ways of approaching or walking into this pandemic. One with healthcare, with wealth, with all sorts of support, and the other, like most of Americans did, without any support whatsoever, where people had to go to work because if they didn't, they couldn't pay for their mortgages or their rents. And there was a lot of misinformation. And what I wanted to create through this platform, through this engaged art platform, was a way for those neighbors to communicate with one another and to share their stories, and importantly, to say that it wasn't okay and that they weren't okay and that they weren't doing good. And that was important to me because that allowed neighbors not just to listen to the politicians and the scientists about what to do and how we have failed or not failed, but for they themselves to opine and to have voice and to be able to document the reality of a pandemic that we are still in, a pandemic that will only get more difficult for us in the coming months, a pandemic that's going to bring a lot of deaths, an unimaginable amount of deaths to my country in February and March of this year, and a pandemic that many Americans still believe is a hoax. So as an artist, I create these processes to begin and try to address these issues. I'm going to play and end this presentation with these two videos. One is a video I created where those very individuals that I was marking on a nightly basis on my diary through May 7th, I continued doing it through November 6th, but from the beginning of the pandemic, our first death here in Miami on March 26th, through the evening before I created this performance art piece at the water's edge, a piece where I drew the number of dead people as markings at the shoreline and let the waves, like the waves in Durban, wash those bodies away. I created this performance piece to honor the dead at the water's edge, at a barrier island, at a very historic barrier island in our community. But not just to honor them there at a place that was once a recreational area under a lighthouse that had now become a funeral site, but also to release them and share them, to share our pain, to share our voices with the rest of the world who had their dead at their shoreline, and sharing them with the world, understanding, as specific as I'm creating these pieces, these 454 marks worth dead who had died until May the 7th in Miami-Dade County. And on May the 8th, these were Miamians, my fellow neighbors, who I was honoring through this performative piece. A second video is the ultimate form of engaging socially. In this case, many of our neighbors, over 3,600 dead in Miami alone, died in isolation. Their families were never able to say goodbye. Many of them walked into the emergency room, were placed in a hospital room, were placed in an intensive care unit, were placed under ventilator. That ventilator was never removed. A family member never visited them. They died alone. There was no closure. The family was completely at their wits' end, unable to connect with their loved one. The loved one died scared and alone. It was a horrible experience. And I wanted to bring closure to that. So as I leave this, what we'll hope will be my first of many interactions with this group, I want to offer you a way of celebrating the lives of your family members that have passed in a way you would have traditionally done it had you been by their bedside. The words you would have said, the words you would have heard. It's my way of bringing closure to a tragedy that has befallen our entire planet.
Walk outside at the appropriate hour, at sunrise or noon or sunset, or at the time the person who you love was pronounced dead due to complications from COVID-19. Stop at the location you've designated to perform this ritual. Close your eyes. Face east. Open your eyes. Take one deep breath. Put your left hand on your heart and think of one loving memory you shared with that person. With your right hand, blow a kiss in the air. Place both hands down. Face them. Turn your body to the direction of the place where your loved one died, alone due to complications from COVID-19. Take 2 deep breaths. Place both hands over your heart. Take your right hand and move it from your heart out in the direction of your loved one as you begin to say the words you would have told them had you been by their side. Take 3 deep breaths. Take your left hand from your heart and reach out to your outstretched hand. Bring both hands back to you, to your heart, as you think of the words your loved one would have told you had they been in front of you. Place both hands down. Face south. Take 1 deep breath. Place both hands on the sides of your head. Think how their life was better because you were in it. Put both hands down. Close your eyes and say the words. You are welcome. Face north. Take 2 deep breaths. Place both hands outstretched in front of you. Think of how your life was better because this person lived. Put your hands down. Bow down. Face west. Take 1 deep breath. Look up to the sky And put your left hand over your heart. Close your eyes. Speak their name. Open your eyes, and as you look up to the sky, say the words, thank you. With your right hand, blow a kiss in the air. And wave goodbye. Bring both hands down to your heart. Take one last deep breath. Place your hands down. Walk back inside.
Thank you very much.